Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is September 3rd, 2024. Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024. And our first story is from Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled Occult Crime Still Unsolved After More Than 40 Years. A brutally slain couple was discovered on a roadside off Route 80 in 1979. Beyond the mystery of who killed them is why the case remains unsolved after more than 4 decades. At first blush, it was believed the couple were murdered in New York and taken across state lines to be dumped in West Paterson, New Jersey. A boy walking his dog found them on December 16, 1979, behind other garbage on an isolated stretch of Squirrelwood Road. The man was wrapped in a blood-stained white canvas tarp and tied with electrical wire. He also had wire around his neck. The woman was rolled into a green tweed outdoor carpet and tied with twine. Like the man, she had twine around her neck. Both of them were fully clothed, had their wrists and ankles tied together, and had been bludgeoned on the side of the head. The Passaic County Medical Examiner's Office ruled that they had been dead at least 24 hours before they were discovered. There was no identification on either of them, and a week later, a laundry slip was found inside the man's corduroy jacket. When traced, it led to IRS Laundry at 248 DeKalb Avenue, Brooklyn. An employee immediately identified a picture of Howard Green. Howard Green, 51, and girlfriend Carol Marone, 33, lived for 7 years in a brownstone basement apartment at 270 DeKalb Avenue, Brooklyn. Neighbors in the artist community of Fort Greene described them as quiet. Inside their 3-bedroom apartment, police found evidence of a minor struggle and some blood, but not enough to indicate it was the murder scene. There was no sign of forced entry, nor was the interior ransacked. Moran's pocketbook was still in the apartment, but there was no money or identification inside it. A bloody footprint and hair were found on the floor of the apartment. Other evidence was found in the garage area. It was a blood-stained piece of wood which was not believed to be the murder weapon. The couple was last seen the night before in a restaurant across the street from their apartment. Howard Green had lived in the area his entire life and worked as a taxi driver to pay the rent. His passion was abstract art, and he worked as a freelance artist. Carol Ann Moran worked as a secretary at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and she also worked as a seamstress and designer of expensive one-of-a-kind outfits she sold to high-status New York department stores. She considered herself a poet and author. 2 weeks prior to her death, she told a friend she was writing a story in which the Shah of Iran was kidnapped, tortured, and hanged so the blood drained from his body. This description would prove to be more than coincidental in the future. Initially, the police could find no motive for the murders. The autopsy report showed that Green had died of brain damage and a skull fracture. 3 weeks after the discovery of the bodies, the police were no closer to finding out who killed them. Investigators from the West Paterson Police, the Passaic County Prosecutor's Office, and the 13th Homicide Squad in Brooklyn said they were still baffled about how and why the couple was murdered. Robert Devereaux, detective with the 13th Homicide Squad, told the newspapers, quote, "We have been pursuing every possible lead we can turn up. It's been a long and tedious process, but we are heading very carefully down every possible road of their lives in this investigation." End quote. Both had applied for passports weeks before their deaths, and Moran had a record of arrests for possession of marijuana and theft in Chicago and Texas. Green was a Korean War tank commander with a clean service and police record. He was described by police as a streetwise guy with no enemies that we could find, sort of the neighborhood bohemian. Somewhere between those hours when they were last seen leaving a Brooklyn neighborhood nightclub at 8 p.m. and their bodies being found, they were killed and dumped in another state. Police wondered why this had been done, since there were plenty of places to discard a body in Brooklyn. In hindsight, considering what happened to the investigation, the perpetrator was more familiar with the roadblocks the investigation would encounter due to more than one jurisdiction being involved. Despite the blood left in the apartment, It did not indicate it was the murder scene, but the explanation for this would soon come to light. The police polygraphed a suspect who had an airtight alibi, but they refused to identify the person. It wasn't until February 1980 that police were looking for their suspect amid a satanic group. The newspapers are describing the crime as bizarre. More details came out about the crime. Most disturbing was that the bodies were mutilated and bloodless. So much so that not even a drop could be squeezed from their hearts for lab samples. Their eyeballs were blown out, the tips of their ears cut off. There was approximately 30 puncture marks made in identical places on the two bodies. Later was found the blood had been drained from their bodies with the use of a veterinary syringe. The small amount of blood found in the apartment testified to the expertise of who had done this. Both had been hit on the left side of the head. Each had a right eye wound and cuts and bruises to the knees and groin. Each had a clump of hair clutched in a fist, a symbol, according to police, common to some satanic groups. Friends told police that in the weeks before their death, the couple had become deeply involved in the occult. The police, after ruling out other motives for the slaying, looked to the murders as the result of some type of ritual. The police were now looking at the couple's former upstairs neighbor. He was described as a drifter who, as a teenager, lived in the West Patterson area where the bodies were dumped. He also had a penchant for decapitating mice and draining their blood. The neighbor said he would wander around with his guitar and dog. He had supposedly gone out to southern Oklahoma about the same time several cows were found slaughtered there, their blood drained. The police refused to identify the man who moved out a year before the murders. He told one police that he called the couple witches, after Moran and Green pronounced him an oddball, and told people to stay away from him. Detective Devereaux said the man was also seen in the West Village area, always with a white shepherd dog. Some neighbors described where Green was unusually nervous and confused in the weeks before his death. By April 1980, the case was unsolved. The police had failed to find the one-time upstairs neighbor, and they had determined that the couple had also been garroted with an electrical cord inside their apartment, which would account for the small amount of blood at the scene. The strongest lead police had involved a New Jersey Bell telephone van a hiker saw near the place where the bodies were found. It was a two-tone green and white truck that had once belonged to the phone company but was sold to the public. The police were in contact with a second-hand vehicle distributor to try to trace its owner. This lead appeared to go nowhere. The weeks marched by, and the only progress the police had made was to rule out certain suspects. The newspapers dropped the story and it faded from the public's view. One of the contradictions among those that investigated the case was whether occult paraphernalia was found in the apartment. The lead investigator in the case, Detective Jim Devereaux, was certain the crime was linked to the occult. He said, "It was definitely a satanic murder, and it was a one-man job. In all of my years in this business, I've never seen anything like this." Maury Terry, an investigative journalist, responded, "The only murderous satanic cult I know of in the New York area is the Son of Sam group, but the NYPD won't admit it exists, so we're stymied. A vet syringe is not a foreign object to people who deal with dogs, you know." In 1987, Maury Terry published The Ultimate Evil, The Search for the Sons of Sam, where he described receiving a letter in 1979 that read, quote, "Dear Maury Terry, please look into this double killing. Carol was asking people about the OTO a year prior to the murders. I can't accept that the people responsible for this are still walking around free. I am afraid that the problems will not go away and that minds this unbalanced may perpetuate additional horrors. Forgive me for not signing my name. I haven't gotten over the fear." End quote. He described where the writer was a friend of Carol Moran, and the OTO referenced in the note was the Ordo Templi Orientis, whose most famous member was Aleister Crowley. Terry described where the apartment was spiced with various items of satanic significance, most probably obtained from an occult shop close to where they lived, a store that served more purpose than one for certain occult adepts. Maury's reference to dogs was that the occult group operating in New York during those years was known to keep German shepherds as pets and also to sacrifice them. Was it coincidental that the murdered couple's upstairs neighbor was seen with a dog that was specifically of this breed? A main theme of Terry's book is that occult practitioners often kill those from among their coven if it proves to be expedient for a number of reasons. According to Moriarty, Untermeyer Park in New York was connected to strange gatherings. By the 1960s, the park fell into disrepair, and the statues throughout the park were swallowed by overgrowth. Around 1970, it was being used for teenage prostitution, hippies, drug abusers, and as a meeting place for dark magic practitioners. Moriarty wrote the following, quote, "On August 11, 1977, two young boys, ages 11 and 14, were walking along the trail somewhat south of Untermeyer Park. They weren't out for a relaxing walk on the warm summer's day. Searching through the tangled brush adjacent to the aqueduct behind Berkowitz's apartment, the youths were on a specific mission. They were looking for a grave. The previous Christmas, they found 3 dead German Shepherd dogs at the site, lying together in separate plastic bags. The boys had buried the animals, but now, hearing of Berkowitz's alleged hatred of canines, they believed their find might be connected to the case. After some publicity about the matter, Yonkers PD picked up the skeletal remains and had them autopsied. 2 of the shepherds, which still had chains around their necks, were strangled. The 3rd was shot in the head." End quote. In 2002, the New York Post wrote an article about the case, which, by then, had remained unsolved for a little over 20 years. Quote, "Confusion among cops as to who should have investigated the ghoulish murder of a Brooklyn couple may have resulted in the case remaining unsolved for more than 20 years. A post-investigation into the double homicide found not only that the trail to the brutal killer had gone cold, but it may have never have been followed properly. Retired detectives from Brooklyn's 88th Precinct and the West Patterson Police Department, along with the Passaic County Prosecutor's Office, confirmed they all thought the others had done the follow-up investigation. A New York police spokesman, Walter Burns, said the Brooklyn Cold Case Squad is currently not working on the case. The post-investigation also found startling inconsistencies in the investigators' recollections of their work. Devereaux said he twice interviewed a resident of the victim's neighborhood, who he reported admitting to having drained the blood of mice he kept. He said he wanted to impress his girlfriend at the time, Devereaux recalled. The man, who now lives out of state, dismissed Devereaux's recollections and says he never met the detective. "Hell no, I never said that stuff," he said, adding he was on a hitchhiking holiday in Texas at the time of the murders. A law professor, end quote, a law professor interviewed by a reporter said that even though it wasn't mandatory, the FBI should have assisted in the case, either because the couple had been kidnapped or the bodies were moved across state lines to hide the crime. After the New York Post ran their story, within a couple of weeks, the Brooklyn Cold Case Squad decided to warm up the investigation. But that's as far as it got. Within weeks of their announcement, the Brooklyn's 88th Precinct couldn't find the case file. What a coinkydink! Short of a deathbed confession or a DNA link, the case seems destined to remain icy cold. So, and this is one of the things that, of course, hindsight's 20/20, but, like, when you look at the original information, they can't figure out this couple lives in Brooklyn. Why did they get dumped somewhere else? And it's like whoever did this, whether it were Satanists or whoever they were, was smart enough to realize that what happened is exactly what happened was exactly what they knew was going to happen, which was all these jurisdictions, everybody passed it off because supposedly the case belongs to where the murder took place. Was it in Brooklyn? Or was it in West Patterson? Where was it? So everybody just like, no, it's yours, no, it's yours, no, it's yours. And even the FBI, which is true, should have been called, even, I imagine, on the suspicion that they were kidnapped or obviously their bodies were transported across state lines. That's a given. And then, what they call the icing on the cake, whoa, this case file disappears. And you know what? And sometimes I know that things, especially as they get older, remember this is a time period when all these things were on paper. This wasn't like the cloud, in other words. Unless they put stuff, all these things are in boxes. They're on paper. And everybody thinks, well, was it one of the detectives? Was it somebody being stupid and lazy and dumped it out? Who knows? Because in other words, there's no way to find out. Did whoever had the case files, did they move to a new building and somewhere along the line? Or you know what? Sometimes, let's go down that rabbit hole. All you need, as you say, doesn't even have to be the detectives. All you need is somebody on the inside, a clerk, a secretary, that whoever was maybe involved in that crime. Let's go with a satanic group angle. Has somebody on the inside. And those people, by the way, if you read enough of these crimes, whether it's a satanic cult or a cult, they specialize in getting their members into positions, not contrary, believe it or not of power, even though you do hear about that. But they get themselves into all these places, even low-level entry jobs, just so that they can have access to certain information. Now it's a little bit more difficult because things are in a computer and you need a password, and there's a paper trail, even though there's no paper, but it's more easily. But back then, it was, all you need is somebody on the in there is tell them, hey, a year has passed, 2 years, nobody, oh yeah, that back room where they keep all those boxes full of the old cases, take that out of there. Sure enough, nobody noticed that all this file in a cold case, a double homicide, was gone. When it disappeared, who knows? So anyway, yeah, there you go. There, short of a DNA link coming up, which I imagine would be impossible because if they lost any material, blood, anything, what are they going to compare it to? I don't think anybody's ever going to know what happened to those two. Okay, off to the next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, and this one is titled The Goat Man Monster of Pope Lick Bridge. Call it urban myth or malevolent elemental spirit, the Goat Man demon that is said to haunt the railroad trestle over the Pope Lick Creek is said to have lured many victims throughout the years. And that is the one real fact about this story, which is the amount of people that have met their death at this spot. The area was named for a salt lick located on land settled by the Pope family. These licks provided salt for the settlers and also attracted game that were used as a food source. The trestle is where the Norfolk Southern Freight Railroad crosses over Pope Lick Creek and South Pope Lick Road, just east of Louisville, Kentucky, in an area called Fisherville. The creature is said to use hypnosis or mimicry to lure the unwary to a dangerous situation where they face either being run over by a locomotive or jumping, which is a 100-foot fall to the rocky ground beneath. In some versions, the Pope Lick monster carries a bloody axe to claim any that survive the ordeal, and he hangs out on the trestles where he jumps down onto the roofs of cars passing beneath it. The origins of the goat demon is as varied as its way to bring you to your doom. In one version, he was a circus freak, part of a traveling 19th century show, who threatened revenge for mistreatment after he escaped when a train derailed on the trestle after being struck by lightning. The other story told by the locals is that he was a farmer who got the short end of a deal with the devil. He had sacrificed goats and sheep to Satan in exchange for eternal life and power over others, which of course he didn't get. What he did get was cursed to look like the animals he had killed. In a variant of this story, the creature was conjured by devil worshippers. The Goat Man is not the only one who is said to haunt the train tracks. A boy lived in a house close to the creek under the trestles. One day he climbed to the top of the hill to watch the train. However, he lost his footing and fell on the tracks when the train was thundering across the bridge, and it ran him over. It said that if you drive under the trestles at twilight, you will see his blue shirt blowing in the wind. Another story that is factual occurred in 1906 when Robert Yeager, a farmer who lived on Pope Lick Road, came home after dark. He found his daughter, Maddie Yeager, 17, hanging by a trace chain from a rafter in the passageway between two rooms. Her face was distorted, which proved she had been there for a few hours. Next to her was an overturned chair. Her mother had been committed to Central Kentucky Asylum for the Insane for 12 years. Maddie is supposed to haunt the area. These stories are all folklore, but what is not is the number of legend trippers that have scaled an 8-foot fence seeking the Goat Man and have found death instead. Foolish trespassers have been struck by the locomotives or fallen off the bridge while climbing the trestles. Legend or no, the Pope Lick monster may have claimed more lives than most myths. In April 1986, David Bryant, 19, jumped from the trestle in order to escape the oncoming train. He died 3 weeks later from his injuries. In February 1988, Charles Jack Baum was killed by the train when he and two friends were walking on the tracks. In April 1994, James Ratterman, 34, was riding his ATV on the tracks when it got stuck. He was about 25 yards out on the trestle, and he was hit by an eastbound train. However, not all stories end in tragedy. There are others who escaped the cursed tracks. In 1994, Deonna Donald, 15, with two other girls, took a shortcut over the trestle. One of the girls was able to run off the end of the tracks. The other leaped 20 feet onto a sandy gulch. Deonna couldn't make it, and she fell between the rails, where she pressed herself against the trestle as the engine and two cars passed over her head. She suffered no serious injuries. In April 2016, a young couple spotted the locomotive bearing down the railroad trestle at over 30 miles an hour. They faced an 8-story drop on either side. With no way to outrun the train, the pair's only hope was to cling to the sides of the track. The engineer later told officials that he blared his horn and tried to slow down. David Nee, 41, who was on the tracks, managed to make the split-second dive to the edge. The train was traveling too fast for his companion. The train fatally struck Raquel Bain, 26, who fell about 100 feet to the ground. The couple had purchased tickets for a midnight tour of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a former tuberculosis clinic turned haunted house. While in Louisville, they caught wind of another occult story, one which they decided to investigate in the twilight hours before their tour, the Poplik Monster. In May 2019, two girls were hit by a Norfolk Southern train. Savannah Bright, 15, was pronounced dead at the scene, and Kaylee Keeling was hospitalized with serious injuries. Unsurprisingly, those who have lived for generations in the area claim the story of the goat monster only came about since the 1980s, and prior to this, teenagers from the area would go to the trestle in a coming-of-age dare, but they were well aware of the train schedule and no one was killed. Present day, the Trestle Bridge is an active train bridge. There is no room at all to stand aside if a train comes across. It is only as wide as the track and has no railings. The uneven surface of the railroad ties make it difficult to traverse in a hurry. If you survive, you might also face trespassing charges. No urban legend is worth your life. West Virginia has its own version of the goat man known as the White Thing, which is described as a mix of humanoid with ram's horns and a sheep's face, which has been seen for decades. So there you go. And one of the things that I've heard, that people think that if you hear that you will be aware of a train coming from from far away, that you'll hear the train, that you'll know that the train is coming, and that'll give you enough time to get out of the way. From what I understand, most people, you become aware of the train right when it's on top of you. Contrary to what people think, that far off you'll hear the train. No, this is what, case in point, all these stories, you become aware that there's a train coming towards you right when it's there. So there you go. The Goat Man Monster, Poplik Bridge. I mean, just like you're better off going to Waverly Hills. Okay. This other story is out of Life Science, and it's titled Closer Than People Think, Woolly Mammoth De-extinction is Nearing Reality, and we have no idea what happens next. Scientists are getting very close to bringing a few iconic species like woolly mammoth and dodos back from extinction. This may not be a good thing. For about 7 minutes in 2003, scientists reversed extinction. The resurrected lineage was the Pyrenean ibex, and the last known species of the last known member of the subspecies, a female named Celia, had died 3 years earlier. Scientists had collected DNA from Celia's ear before her death and injected her genetic material into a domesticated goat egg cell with its nucleus removed. The resulting clone, the first and only extinct creature to have been revived at the time, died soon after birth due to a lung defect. Although that effort failed to produce a healthy animal, de-extinction science has advanced dramatically in the past 2 decades. Technology is no longer a significant hurdle to reviving recently extinct species, and in many cases we have enough DNA to piece together functional genomes for cloning. The question isn't so much whether we can resurrect lost species, but if we should. Some companies aren't waiting to answer that question. For instance, Colossal Bioscience, a Texas-based biotechnology and genetic engineering company, plans to bring back three iconic extinct species: the dodo, the Tasmanian tiger, also known as thylacine, and the woolly mammoth. The ultimate goal for these de-extinction efforts, according to Colossal's website, is to enrich biodiversity, replenish vital ecological roles, and bolster ecosystems' resilience. But a catastrophic outcome cannot be ruled out, other experts say. We have this hubris as humans that we can control our technology. Oswald Schmitz, a professor of population and community ecology at Yale University. I'm not so convinced. Even in the best case scenarios, conservationists are skeptical that bringing back creatures that died out centuries or millennia ago will offer as much benefit as preserving the ones that are still hanging on. What's gone is gone, Schmidt said. Recent breakthroughs have brought scientists closer than people think to reviving long extinct species. Ben Lamb, co-founder and CEO of Colossal Biosciences, said that the company aims to produce its first mammoth look-alike calves by 2028, and it is highly likely that one could see another species before then, referring to Colossal's other de-extinction projects. Woolly mammoths lived in the Arctic between 300,000 and 10,000 years ago. To produce the calves, Colossal scientists will first identify the genes encoding the woolly mammoth's most emblematic physical traits such as shaggy hair, curved tusks, fat deposits, and a dome-shaped cranium. They will then insert these genes into the genome of a closely related and therefore genetically similar Asian elephants. De-extinction can have different meanings, and our capabilities for de-extinction depends on how we define it. Love Dalen, a paleogeneticist and professor of evolutionary genomics at Stockholm University, said in an email, "De-extinction in the sense of creating a form of hybrid species that looks like the extinct one by replacing a limited number of key genes is possible if there is available DNA from the extinct species," said Dalen, who sits on Colossal's advisory board. There is no available DNA from dinosaurs, so creating a Jurassic Park is currently more of a pipe dream. Creating an animal that is genetically identical to the extinct species is trickier and depends on the species. For species that went extinct very recently and for which there are high-quality DNA samples, like Celia, this could be possible. That's not the case for mammoths, however. Dalen and his colleagues have come close to sequencing complete woolly mammoth genomes, but a few regions of DNA, such as some strings of repeat code, still prove challenging. So far, Colossal Biosciences has acquired more than 60 partial woolly mammoth genomes, which it will use to edit elephant genomes in the lab. Once they have settled on a DNA sequence, Colossal representatives say they will implant a hybrid elephant-mammoth embryo into an Asian or African elephant surrogate. The company also plans to resurrect the dodo and thylacine. On the dodo project, we have only one nearly complete genome, Lamb said, while on the thylacine, which only went extinct last century, we've got much better genetic data right out of the gate. For the dodo, Colossal plans to implant the genetic material into domesticated chickens, and for the thylacine into mouse-like marsupials called fat-tailed Dunarts. The goal of de-extinction is to fill ecological niches that have stood empty since the original species disappeared, said Ronald Godry, an ecologist and the director of the Taurus Foundation, a branch of Rewilding Europe that aims to create a substitute for extinct aurochs. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, once roamed across North Africa, Asia, and nearly all of Europe. They likely played a vital role in maintaining animal and plant biodiversity through grazing and trampling the soil, according to the Taurus Foundation. Godry and his colleagues are bringing aurochs back through backbreeding, which doesn't involve genetic engineering. Humans hunted aurochs to extinction in 1627, but their DNA lives on in ancient cattle breeds living in southern Europe. Godry said, by selecting and breeding together cattle with physical attributes, behavioral traits, and genes similar to those of aurochs, ecologists are inching towards reviving the lost species. We're very close, Godry said. We see very large, steep progress with each generation. Woolly mammoths, which thrived during the Pleistocene epoch, maintained Arctic grasslands by trampling the snow, suppressing tree and shrub growth, and dispersing nutrients across huge distances via their dung. Without mammoths and other now extinct mega herbivores, the so-called mammoth steppe has given way to a waterlogged landscape of mossy tundra, shrubs, and forest. Research suggests this new landscape stores less carbon than grasslands did and is more susceptible to permafrost thaw. Some scientists have proposed that introducing mega herbivores to the Arctic could help restore the ecosystem, boost carbon storage, and mitigate climate change. Give me a break. They're crazy. The dodo was one of the largest terrestrial animals in its ecosystem in Mauritius. Evidence suggests dodos were seed dispersers and thereby influenced vegetation growth, although some experts question the extent to which the birds shaped their ecosystem. Colossal's plans to reintroduce dodos include ridding Mauritius of invasive species so that the birds can thrive, which the company argues has a beneficial halo effect for other species. Lamb said the company is working with the Mauritanian Wildlife Foundation, a non-governmental organization or NGO, and intends to partner with the Mauritanian government according to its website. As for the thylacine, it was Tasmania's only marsupial apex predator, according to the University of Melbourne's Tiger Lab, which is also working on de-extinction. As such, the species was important for predator-prey relationships that stabilize the ecosystem. But de-extinct species can fulfill their ecological roles only if they survive in the wild and their populations are large enough. Godry said, in the case of mammoths, that's a behemoth task. Researchers recently estimated that Alaska's vast North Slope could support 48,000 woolly mammoths. But to fulfill their ecological role, which may include increasing the albedo effect, where snows cool Earth by reflecting light back into space, mammoths would likely need to be reintroduced across the Arctic, said Vincent Lynch, an evolutionary biologist and associate professor at the University of Buffalo. You can't just put them in Alaska and fix the permafrost problem. You have to put them everywhere. There would need to be several 100,000 mammoths to have a significant impact on the climate that could put living endangered species in peril, Lynch said. Both Asian and African elephants, which Colossal plans to use as surrogates to grow mammoth calves, are endangered, and every elephant gestating a mammoth calf can't grow babies of its own. That's going to reduce population size, Lynch said. The alternative would be to implant embryos into artificial wombs, but those have yet to be fully developed. There would be like hundreds of thousands of artificial uteruses in a warehouse somewhere churning out genetically engineered mammoths, Lynch said. This is like 1984 scary stuff, you don't say. Unintended consequences. In addition to facing technological hurdles, de-extinction could have serious repercussions. For one, de-extinct animals may be sickly, given that the pool of available DNA for each species is relatively small. Sustaining populations requires a sufficient number of creatures that are genetically different enough to buffer against disease and harmful mutations. It's also worth considering who would be liable if large-scale mammoth reintroductions went wrong. The ecosystem has been adapting to the absence of mammoths since mammoths started going extinct, Lynch said. What if there's an unintended consequence and something bad happens? That's a very important question right there. Other experts echoed Zoko's concerns. To get some impact, you need to have a lot of animals. Sophie Montserrat, an ecologist and the rewilding manager at Rewilding Europe, said, reintroductions can lead to clashes between humans and wildlife. In Africa, if you look at elephant conservation and reintroductions, then there are conflicts, Montserrat said. In Kenya alone, human-elephant conflicts killed 200 people between 2010 and 2017, according to the WWF. If scientists were to succeed in creating a viable mammoth population, they would have to roll out continent-wide education programs, teaching people how to react in front of a mammoth. Oh boy. The makeup of the reintroduced population matters too. Brown bears that were brought from Slovenia to the Italian Alps in the 2000s are thriving, but it turns out that the source population was particularly aggressive. Schmidt said, ecologists didn't necessarily do their homework, he said. They reintroduced them and now they're attacking livestock and people. There's also no guarantee that animals will stay where we release them. Schmidt said, in 1995, gray wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, but have roamed far beyond the park's boundaries. If you unleash something in nature, these animals are going to find places that are the most suitable for them, and may not be the places where you think they will stay, Schmidt says. And although mega herbivores helped with carbon storage during the last ice age, restoring megafauna may just as well have a negative impact on climate change. Dalen said, for instance, mammoths could theoretically contribute to global warming by eroding the permafrost during the warm season and by emitting methane. They could also reduce the amount of carbon stored in woody plants, as elephants do when they eat plants in American savannas. And they could kill people, and they could kill other animals, including apex predators. Yeah, forget the methane, man. What about the people and other animals? While proponents think de-extinction is a valuable conservation tool, critics say money would be better spent on existing initiatives. Colossal Bioscience has raised at least $225 million to fund its de-extinction programs, with some of that money also going towards conservation genetic research across the globe. Instead of using that money to bring back 3 extinct species whose ecological impact is unknown, the funds could be put better, roughly saving 100 species that are currently facing an uncertain future. Better, much better. In some cases, de-extinction targets species with a living equivalent, fulfilling similar ecological functions. For example, one reason the thylacine went extinct was that people perceived it as a predator of livestock. But we have a similar animal right now that's facing similar persecution, and that's the dingo. Lynch agreed that the best way to support conservation is to spend money on existing proven initiatives. It's probably impossible to introduce an ecologically significant number of de-extinct species, which also raises questions about the purpose of de-extinction companies like Colossal. Adam Searle, a research fellow in cultural, historical, and environmental geography at the University of Nottingham in the UK, said de-extinction is unlikely to contribute to solving the ecological crisis. It's literally a pet project of billionaires. In response to Searle's comments, Lamb said in an email that for every de-extinction target, the technology and techniques developed will benefit closely related species. He further argued that technological innovations made and funded by private sector companies are vital to this fight. Regardless of Colossal's ecological impact, the company could still see a big return on investment. If they're successful, and I have no doubt that they will be, they're going to make a ton of money. For the rest of us and for nature, however, the extinction could do a lot more harm than good. As you can see, I'm not a big proponent. I did my own editorial opinion comments in this, but I couldn't help myself. You know, animals on this planet have gone through epochs of extinction. And it's not only because the meteor came down and hit. I'm talking, it happens. Some species go totally extinct. Others adapt and change. So in a way, their ancestors become extinct. And they develop, they either grow or become smaller. And it's like, that's what happens in nature. Things go away, new things come in. They adapt to what the climate is at that time, where their environment is, and so forth and so on. I think that's this thing of bringing back these animals. No. You know what? Instead of bringing back the woolly mammoth, why don't you help out, like they were saying, the herds of existing elephants, if there's a conservation, but you're going to use them as living incubators when you already got a population that's threatened? And they belong. They're here. They're now. They belong to this world, to this earth at this time period. That's the part I don't get. If you're going to use it, I agree. And one of those scientists said it very clearly. Just because you can doesn't mean we should. It's a slippery slope. And everybody thinks it's a pet thing of the billionaires. I'm going to tell you where that goes. For some reason, not everybody, but a lot of these people that have lots of money that they don't know what to do with, they have the money, how's this, to say, I want my own mammoth. I want my own thylacine. I want my own dodo bird. And then they'll pay to have their own pet, whatever. I'm going to give you a quick case in point. Pablo Escobar, that famous drug dealer lord in Colombia, which he had money that he didn't know what to do with. He decided to make his own zoo in Colombia, in his hacienda out in the middle of Colombia. He brought over 6 hippos. Guess what? And when he got killed and caught, it just so happens that the placing of these hippos was perfect. Now they've got like they're overrun with hippos. They've got like 600 hippos that have overrun. Of course, they don't have any type of predator or population control. They've attacked people. They've actually killed a couple of people. They're doing damage, and they've gone far beyond Pablo's original 6 hippos. All right, my point being that you think that there's always some rocket scientists out there that even though they say, you know what, reproducing these animals, even we've realized we can. There's always somebody that doesn't know what to do with their money, says, I want one of those. Make me a mammoth, but not the... Plus, I agree, a lot of these animals, this clone thing, I think that a lot of these animals, they come out with some type of defect. Something like, just like that ibex. And from when you listen to that, that was an animal. In other words, they took tissue. They took a sample from a living animal. This was as recent as you're going to get. And even then, that try came out with a defective lung, which I'm sure, by the way, when they publish all these things, they've gone far beyond it. We're getting the tail end of the story. So God knows there's probably a few ibexes running around in somebody's lab somewhere. I don't know. I'm very, it's a slippery slope downward. Slippery slope downward for the humans that are on this planet now and all the other animals and the environment, everything. Like they said, some of these people, they got to think good and hard about what they're doing. All right, let's go back to Stranger Than Fiction stories, and this story is titled Missing Doesn't Always Mean Dead. Missing is a word that usually precedes a case that may end in tragedy where the person has committed suicide or has been the victim of foul play. When nothing is forthcoming, it's a double-edged sword for the family. Not knowing provides a measure of comfort but allows the imagination to run wild. In 2013, the last sighting of Robert Hoagland, 49, was captured on a security camera at a mobile gas station. Hoagland's wallet, meds, cell phone, and vehicles were at his home. He didn't go to work or pick up his wife at the airport. Hoagie, as he was known to family and friends, had nothing in his past to indicate he would disappear, commit suicide, or have been the victim of a crime. He worked from home as a real estate appraiser. The last banking activity was when he withdrew $600 from an account, and that was it. He had raised 3 sons with his wife. One of them, Max 23, battled drug addiction earlier in 2013 and had been in rehab. Before his disappearance, his wife had left on a 2-week trip to Turkey with friends. During this time, 2 laptop computers were stolen from the home. Hoagland thought perhaps his son had taken them in order to buy drugs. On the same day Hoagland disappeared, his son was arrested by police for trespassing at a building known for drug sales and prostitution. Initially, the Hoagland family was not alarmed. They told authorities he might have gone on his own to hike the Appalachian Trail. Eventually, wooded areas around Sandy Hook where they lived were searched, including the use of dogs. Nothing was found. Time failed to produce any clue of what happened to Robert Hoagland. Family and friends believe foul play was involved. Police concluded he had left on his own. Several sightings in the following years led to a dead end. Could he have been the victim of foul play as a result of his son's drug problem? The story was featured on an episode of Disappeared in 2016, and this failed to produce any results. The trail went cold. Was he missing or dead? The answer to the question was revealed almost 10 years later when a man found his roommate dead on December 5th, 2022, inside the apartment they shared. The name he was using was Richard King. EMT responded to a call for cardiac arrest, but there was nothing to be done. Police found paperwork among his belongings with his real name. Robert Hoagland had been living in Rock Hill, New York, about 100 miles from his original home, since 4 months after he disappeared in 2013. Not much is known about where he went in the first months after he disappeared, or how he made a living. The roommate, who only gave the name of David, described where he had met Hoagland when he put an ad in Craigslist for a roommate. Hoagland didn't have ID but said he had just gone through a bitter divorce and he just wanted to start a new life. A co-worker came and vouched for Hoagland, and the two men came to an agreement. The roommate setup was done behind the scenes since the leasing office didn't allow subletting. They struck up a close friendship, and when David purchased his home in 2020, Hoagland moved with him as a roommate. He noticed that Hoagland's health was in decline in the last 6 months of his life. There was no sign of foul play. Why he decided to leave everything and everyone behind in 2013 is a mystery he took to the grave. However, he is not the only one that just leaves friends, family, and everything that is a part of their lives to start somewhere fresh and anonymously. These are stories that people have reported. First one, quote, "My grandmother's brother disappeared from Montreal. Had a wife and 2 children. Years and years later, my aunt saw an obituary for a man with the same name in St. Catharines, Ontario. There was a wife listed in the obit. So my aunt contacted the woman and went to visit her. It was definitely him. At least my grandmother died knowing what happened to him." Next story. My uncle went missing back in 1996. He wrote a note saying he was tired of life and left everything behind to my dad. We reported him missing to the police, and my dad hired a private investigator to look for him. Years went by. They found nothing. Come 2002, a detective called my dad claiming they found my uncle living in another part of Queens. But the geniuses didn't even check to see the person's age living there was way off my uncle's age. And of course that ended up to be my dad's uncle, who had the same name as my missing uncle. So now on to 2016. My dad gave his DNA to run through the database of unidentified remains. A few weeks later, they called back and said, "We found no matches." Now fast forward to March 2022. My dad gets a phone call from the NYPD. "We found your brother. He's been buried in Pottersfield since 1996. Wonderful police work. Apparently, they found my uncle's body in a park right up the street from his house where he was last seen. They said his body was too decomposed to determine who it was, but here's the kicker. My uncle was 6 feet 4 inches, so even if they had a bone, they could tell that this was a pretty big guy. So nobody put one and one together. So apparently his cause of death was a shot in the head. And I still wonder why nobody reported a shot being fired. But it was around 4th of July, so possibly people thought it was a firework. Oh, and the biggest kicker of them all, they made my dad pay $5,000 to dig him up." End quote. What happens when someone disappears and their family fails to report it to police? Is this a sign of duplicity or frustration and hopelessness? In September 1961 was the last time neighbors in the Surrey, British Columbia neighborhood saw Lucy Ann Johnson. However, none seemed to think anything was wrong, or if they did, no one contacted the authorities. Lucy was originally from Alaska and had married Marvin Johnson in 1954. He did not report her missing until May 14, 1965. Immediately, suspicion fell on him. His only admission was that she had left him and their 2 children over 3 years before. The yard where he lived was dug up, but yielded nothing. The years moved forward, and DNA from Lucy's children were compared to Jane Doe's in the hope a match could be made. Marvin Johnson remarried and died in the 1990s of natural causes. By then, the case was more than 3 decades old and as cold as ever. Lucy's daughter Linda, despite the probability that her mother was dead, never gave up hope. In 2013, she put ads in newspapers in northern British Columbia where her mother had ties to. Only a few weeks before, Lucy Johnson's disappearance was part of Surrey's RCMP's Missing of the Month series, which highlighted cold cases. Then police received a message from a woman living in Yukon named Rhonda. She recognized a picture in the ad because this woman was her mother as well. Lucy Johnson, now in her 70s, said she had left because Marvin was abusive and would not let her leave with their children. She remarried and had 4 children. Eventually, she was reunited with her daughter Linda. Theodore John Conrad was a 20-year-old bank teller who stole $215,000 in cash, equivalent to $1.59 million present day, from a Cleveland bank in 1969. It all started when he became a teller at the National Bank in Cleveland in January 1969. One of the things he first noticed was how lax the security was. To mark his 20th birthday in July, he walked out on a Friday afternoon with a paper bag stuffed with cash from the vault. Not until Monday was the theft discovered, and by then he had flown the coop. Letters to his then girlfriend indicated he stopped in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles within the first week. He thought the crime had a 7-year statute of limitations, after which he could return, but this turned out not to be accurate. After this, Conrad cut ties with all his family, so strictly that eventually some believed he was dead. The last possible sighting of him was in October 1969, when a Cleveland couple met a man in Hawaii who they thought looked very much like Conrad. And something that was not unusual in those years, Conrad went to a Social Security office in Boston and asked for a Social Security number to be issued to him with a different name and a birth date, making him 2 years older than he actually was. The name he used was Thomas Randell. This opened the door for him to establish a new life. Thomas Randell went on to become a manager in a country club outside Boston. During the decade of the 70s, he worked as an assistant golf pro, who none would have suspected was a wanted man in one of Cleveland's biggest bank heists. The crime got little coverage in the news, since this was the week Apollo 11 made their historic flight to the moon. Thomas Randell married in 1982, and later a daughter Ashley was born to them. He was employed as a car salesman in a Land Rover and Volvo dealership in the area, retiring after 40 years of working in the business. Besides the mystery of his disappearance, another question that remained unanswered was why he had done it. A high school friend said that once he stole a deck of cards just to prove he could do it. Authorities believed he was inspired by the 1968 movie The Thomas Crown Affair, in which Steve McQueen plays a character who gets away with a $2.6 million heist. A friend who knew him during the 1960s said he watched the movie at least half a dozen times and convinced his grandmother to lend him money to buy a bright red on black MG midget. To complete the look, he bought leather driving gloves. This same friend recalled that Conrad would comment how easy it would be to take money from the bank. After the robbery, Conrad went to Boston, which coincided where much of the movie was filmed, and perhaps it was no coincidence he took the new name of Thomas, just like the movie's main character. U.S. Marshal Elliott was assigned to the case, and he crisscrossed the United States following any leads that would take him to where he could arrest Conrad. Even after he retired in 1990, he continued to check with his son Pete Elliott, who had become the top U.S. Marshal in Cleveland. Elliott Sr. died in March 2020 before learning the truth of where the fugitive he had sought for so many years could be found. As the years passed, the FBI was said to attend reunions for the class of 1967, once a table was put out for Conrad, along with a cutout. His co-workers said they never heard him raise his voice or speak badly about anyone. He wasn't a drinker or a gambler. He knew how to control his emotions and rarely got upset. And what happened to the money? Did he lose it through bad investing or gambling? In 2014, Randell and his wife, Kathy, filed for bankruptcy. Records showed they owed $160,000 in credit card debt and had few assets. His family did not know the truth until he made a deathbed confession when he was dying from lung cancer. After his death, his wife has refused to be interviewed. His friends, now in hindsight, remember he always sported a beard and used sunglasses while on the golf course. He didn't like to talk about his family of origin or where he grew up at. They figured this was reticence was due to a bad childhood. It's unknown who brought Randall's obit to the attention of the U.S. Marshals, and it declined to say who it was. So see, missing doesn't always mean dead. Far from it. And you ask yourself, why? Why do people just do that? It's as complicated as a variety of reasons. Next story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories. This is titled The Lost Romance of Contemporary Architecture. Why do you think modern buildings are more likely to be graffitied versus older construction? Because people do not like them. The British author Douglas Adams had this to say about airports. Airports are ugly. Some are very ugly. Some attain a degree of ugliness that can only be the result of special effort. This observation holds true for many other examples of contemporary architecture. The Tour Montparnasse, a black skyscraper that looms over Paris like a monolith from a dystopian future, was erected in 1973, and it was the tallest building in France then. Montparnasse was a slum area historically characterized by overcrowding, poverty, and poor living conditions. Parisians hated the building from the beginning. The long-standing joke has been that the tower has the best view in Paris because it's the only place from which you can see it. 4 years after it was completed, Paris banned buildings over 7 stories, and high-rises could only be built on the outskirts of the city. Post-World War II, in the suburbs beyond Paris, brutalist apartment blocks were built as affordable housing. Meant for the working class, they instead were occupied by large immigrant populations from the Middle East, Maghreb, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The design of the buildings were compared to those found in the Soviet Union. The architects who designed the buildings were Urbain Cassan, Eugene Baudin, Louis de Hoym de Marienne, and Jean Sabat. A 2008 poll voted the building the second ugliest building in the world. If you wondered which building was voted the ugliest, it's Boston's City Hall Plaza. It's a controversial example of brutalist architecture designed by Gerhard Kalman, a Columbia University professor, and Michael McKinnell, a Columbia graduate student who co-founded Kalman, McKinnell, and Knowles. Erected in the 1960s, even before it was finished, there were calls to demolish it. Mayor John F. Collins reportedly gasped as the design was first unveiled, and someone in the room blurted out, "What the hell is that?" It's been called a dark and unfriendly eyesore among Boston's examples of genteel architecture that reflects its history dating back to revolutionary times. A complex of attached federal buildings are equally distasteful. Contemporary architecture alienates regular humans, and one could believe they are the products of architect school rejects. However, most architects will argue they are examples of wonderful engineering. Believe it or not, there's a school of contemporary architecture known as Bloblicher, which is a product of computer-driven algorithms. Buildings designed in this fashion you would think would be found on the blob's home planet, where dreary and ugly are in vogue, but unfortunately are found on planet Earth. The designs are hopeless, cold, and unappealing. It's not only select examples of architecture that are unimaginative and dreary, but in the last 60 years has been a concerted effort to design unappealing and ugly buildings. This observation is not lost in the majority of the populace, where public opinion favors structures dating to pre-World War II. And isn't that what it's all about? How a building or monument makes you feel. Humans are not robots, and emotion will always win over logic. After the Grenfell Tower in the UK fire in 2017, there were calls for more comfortable public housing. However, left-wing writers defended the high-rise apartment buildings, despite feedback that people do not prefer to live in places like this. Why are so many on the left married to these unpopular urban design styles? Normal humans become depressed when cut off from nature, color, light, and social interaction with other humans. Why would modern architecture believe humans would want to live or visit places that inspire feelings of sadness? Historically, builders and designers have understood this, as exemplified by 2,000 years of architecture from around the world. Is it coincidental that vacationers will travel further and pay extra to stay at historical locations? What went wrong after World War II? This could be traced to an earlier time at the turn of the 20th century when ornaments disappeared, and form follows function was articulated by Louis Sullivan, an American architect, who nonetheless designed elaborate ornaments for buildings he designed. Architect Adolf Loos in 1908 declared that lack of ornamentation was a sign of spiritual strength. For some reason, architects interpreted these observations to be a call for simplicity and utilitarianism. Quote, "These two ideas quickly became dogmas of the architectural profession. A generation of architects, with both socialistic and fascistic political leanings, saw ornament as a sign of bourgeois decadence and cultural indulgence, and began discarding every design element that could be considered mere decoration." End quote. What's sad is that many of these architectural monstrosities are touted as innovative and inspiring. One could say that Art Deco is the last gasp of a beautiful movement in architecture, before buildings were produced by persons who were more social engineers and creators of places humans relish to visit or live in. French architect Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, known as Le Corbusier, described a house as a machine for living. His 1925 Plan Voisin in Paris would require demolishing half of Paris north of the Seine and erecting 12 towering duplicate skyscrapers. The idea didn't go beyond the design stage. He considered decorations as perversions and stated, quote, rustling silks, the marbles which twist and turn, the vermilion whiplashes, the silver blades of Byzantium and the Orient. Let's be done with it. End quote. What's difficult to understand is how uniform the architectural designs touted as progressive went against what has been the preferred forms of ornaments such as grillwork or gargoyles. Instead of transcendence, it wanted to remind humans that life was violent and brutal. A chaotic building could be considered honest, and a beautiful building is deceitful. Peter Eisman designed a disharmonious house in 1975 that caused the owners to write a book about the difficulties they experienced while trying to live in it. The master bedroom was split so the couple couldn't sleep together. A precarious staircase didn't have a handrail and initially omitted bathrooms from the design. In 1982, a debate with architect Christopher Alexander, Eisman declared that once you've seen one Gothic cathedral, you've seen them all. Alexander replied, I find that incomprehensible. I find it very irresponsible. I find it nutty. I feel sorry for the man. I also feel incredibly angry because he is fucking up the world. That's great. 20th century architecture eschews the use of symmetries, where arches and classical domes are taboo. All the additives that made structures attractive, such as arcades, cornices, cupolas, or spires, have been dumped, even if the results are ugly structures. It's a murder of European imperialist art, or so they think. The original Penn Station, with its breathtaking design, was so beautiful it had to be destroyed. It was considered a Beaux Art architectural magnum opus of the 20th century. It opened in 1910, and its 84 door columns were reminiscent of ancient Rome. Despite loud protests, it was demolished in 1963 to make room for the construction of Madison Square Garden. Modern architecture ignores the wishes of the people who have to use the building. The people do not have any participation in the final product. One has to wonder if some architects are intimidated into producing irrational designs which are falsely described as clever. British freelance writer Sam Criss ludicrously claimed that brutalist Alexandra Road, designed by Nave Brown, is more beautiful than St. Paul's Cathedral. By the way, that Alexandra Road is in the United Kingdom. In 2017, Criss was dropped by Vice after a Facebook allegation of sexual harassment or assault went viral, and later his own admission and apology about the incident. Brown's concrete creation were not to taste when they were first built in the 1970s and led to the sacking of Brown. The public housing project was ugly and very costly. These are individuals who hate nationalism and tradition, but the fact remains that ancient structures are the most beautiful the world over, and are admired by their populace and visitors from other lands. Simplicity and complexity can be married and produce beautiful architecture. The absence of ornaments and symmetry on a building is a study in tedium, ennui, and stupidity, masquerading as being profound. For example, flowers and plant life enriches architecture, but post-war architecture is sterile and devoid of nature, with its blank walls and concrete spaces. Many times brutalist creations are salvaged with the presence of trees and plants, especially if they cover most of the concrete. Brutalism is the opposite of democracy. It means imposing on people something they hate, for the sake of some narrow and arbitrary formalistic conceptual scheme. If anything, this one-size-fits-all designs are flat, with a prefabricated flavor that's unoriginal and uninspiring. One cannot make decisions for private owners. But if tax dollars are to be used for any structures, then as citizens we should raise our voices and dissent and say, no, that's ugly, no more of this schizoid view of the world. Then give the government officials the stink eye, as in you better not okay this, or you'll be out of a job come the next election. It has to start somewhere, and when better than now? I agree. I love ornamentation architecture. None of that square. I don't even like IKEA furniture. How's that? So of course I don't like it on the outside. So anyway, here we are. come to the end of the show for now. Believe me, I will be back soon, very soon, with some more eerie news. Until next time, take care.